I have Carol Roth here.
I am a recovering investment banker, entrepreneur, TV pundit, author, and my latest book, the third in a trilogy that aren't really a trilogy, is called You Will Own Nothing, Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back, which comes out July 18th. You Will Own Nothing obviously came out of the World Economic Forum and their top 8 predictions for 2030, which came from their global future councils. And the number one prediction they had from now what is about 7 years in the future is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And when I first heard about this on social media, you kind of figure, oh, this is one of those things those social media people got wrong. It happens all the time. But there's no way that this organization that's filled with the elite political and business and academic folks in the world are predicting the end of private property, within a decade's time. So I did a very small amount of research. It actually didn't take me very long to find this one at all. And sure enough, right there in a video that is still connected to their Twitter feed, they have the saying, you'll own nothing, you'll be happy, along with a bunch of other very interesting predictions, which we can get into. And I go, okay, well, that's interesting. So then I decided to do more research, and I found that this was something that they've actually been kind of repackaging in different ways for quite some time. It came from a 2016 article that was sort of espousing this idea that, I'm living in the future and I own nothing and it's so great. And then in 2017, they had a video that was something along the lines of, can you rent everything in your life, and trying to make your entire life into this like library system. So clearly this concept of non-ownership wasn't just this one-off thing that was taken and kind of went left at Albuquerque. It's something that's very core that they've been trying to champion. And as somebody who tries to help people accumulate wealth, I've learned over a couple of decades that the foundation of wealth, the way that you get wealthy, is through ownership, and more specifically of assets, owning assets that can at least retain their value, but hopefully appreciate in value. So when you think of the implications of not having any private property and then wanting you to rent everything and what that means for people's wealth in the future, it was just pretty staggering to connect those dots.
So when Mark Morano talks about this, he says, like, in this future utopia, we wouldn't own our own blender, that when we need a blender, we're going to order it up and it's going to get delivered just in time. And I guess we return it when we're done. Is that what this is, or what?
So certainly I think it's across the board. They don't want you to own anything. And a blender is one piece of it, but a very small piece of it. I think the concept, that the second part of you'll own nothing is, and you'll be happy. They want people to believe in that utopia, to believe in that concept, that being free from any obligation and just, having these things appear, at your whim, if that even could work, would somehow be a great thing. And hoping that you would just forget all of the history where all of the people who did not have ownership were very much unfree and not happy, if they even were, able to manage being killed in those types of regimes. But I do think that training people on the smaller things, and obviously this is a big thing that's happening with big tech right now, licensing your life to you as a subscription or a service and not really owning thing, trains you for bigger pieces of non-ownership. And you can think about one of the emerging trends that's most staggering to me is the non-ownership of homes and the concept of renting the American dream. If you look across all asset categories, a house is by dollar value, the largest portion of most households' wealth across the country. And so the concept that within the last, call it 13 years, Wall Street is now competing with people to buy homes. They're purchasing, in recent quarters, somewhere between 18 and 21% of all the homes out there. And their intention isn't to fix them up and flip them so that you can buy them. It's to rent you that dream. You start with the blender, and then it becomes the home, and then it becomes, your entire life. And what is it that you're owning to be able to build that wealth and have that legacy to pass down to your family? And then without having that wealth and with having it accumulated in just big tech and Wall Street and really these elite players, it really changes the dynamics around freedom and agency and sort of the fundamental foundation of what this country was built on.
So who will own everything in this utopia then? Is Bill Gates type people will own everything and they'll have control of everything? That's what's happening?
It seems that that's their plan. So, one of the other conspiracies that I addressed, and I say conspiracies, in quotes, is this idea of a new financial world order. And everyone's very focused on the WEF's number one prediction, but the number two prediction is that the US will no longer be the world's leading superpower. And so you have to kind of go, okay, well, how's that happening? And then you do a very minimal amount of research again, and you look at President Biden talking to the Business Roundtable, which is the CEOs of all the leading companies in this country. And March 21st of 2022, in comments that you can find on the White House's website, he very, very clearly said, there's going to be a new global economic order. And this is something that happens every 3 or 4 generations. And there's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it. And I'm assuming we meant him and the people in that room, the big company CEOs. Probably I wasn't included. I didn't ask, but I'm just guessing I probably wasn't included in that. And this is something the students of history and many other pundits and writers have talked about, as sort of the changing of the global financial order. So one of my theses in the book is that you have these very smart and well-connected people, and they see that the U.S. is run as the sort of center of the global financial universe, is getting a little long in the tooth, and that there are going to be shifts. And some of them want to help it along, and some of them just say, well, it's happening anyway, so we've got to make sure that we're going to be the ones that come out on top. And so, yes, I do think it's the people who are, the most wealthy and well-connected, but it's not every wealthy and well-connected person, right? You have to be in that sort of political inner group, which I think, is sort of why wealthy doesn't necessarily translate to elite. And there are some elite people who maybe aren't as wealthy as others, although certainly putting themselves on the track to gain more wealth. People from academia, look at Janet Yellen, who is failing upwards at an amazing rate, first as Fed chair and then as Treasury Secretary. She's only been in academia. In between those positions, she made more than $7 million in giving speeches to the Wall Street elite. So, she may not be as wealthy as Larry Fink of BlackRock, but she's certainly trying to put herself into that order, so to speak.
And when you talk about the Wall Street elite, you were part of them, right? You were in those circles. You know what it's like on the inside.
So I was an investment banker, but I certainly was not what I would consider part of the Wall Street elite. I worked at a boutique firm in San Francisco. They did at one point have a New York office, but it wasn't, kind of central. I was promoted very quickly as a vice president by the time I was 25 and an officer of the firm, but I was never really asked my opinion on anything other than, how do you do this initial public offering or, this merger? I wasn't sort of at the top of any food chain, and I have not been invited to any sort of interesting cabals or events or things like that. Actually, at most, so, I'll call myself out on this, because I was actually a useful idiot at one point in time for the World Economic Forum. So this is part of the interesting thing, that as you dig into the research, you really get to see how these bad ideas become entrenched, because most people don't really realize what these organizations are saying. So I would say maybe it was back in 2010 or 2011, something like that, when I was doing more blogging and Twitter was a totally different place. I was invited through blogging friends to go to New York and to go to some World Economic Forum event where people were talking about their books. I remember Blue Ocean Strategy, I think, was one of them, and just kind of mundane business topics, and tweet about them and go, oh, how great the World Economic Forum is. And I was like, okay, that seemed fine, not sort of realizing this whole scope of other information and ideas that were out there. And so, I myself for a hot minute was that useful idiot going, oh, look, here's an organization that has great ideas, when I really didn't understand the depth of what was there. So we can all be subject to it.
I think you've said elsewhere that there are people that are working with ESG all the time, ESG professionals. They don't really know where it came from, and they don't really understand it. Does that sound right?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily just sound right. It is right. I have talked to C-level executives, people who are in charge with ESG experts in their title, that have never heard of the World Economic Forum, that don't know where ESG comes from, and frankly, don't understand it other than, oh, this sounds interesting, or we just need to go along with it because it's the current thing and we want to make sure we're not doing anything else. And that's really the staggering part of it, is that when these bad ideas come down and they get carried in to corporate America, or they get carried into the governments by some of these big organizations, a lot of the people just don't, they have now become the useful idiots, and in a much more significant way than just putting out a few blog posts. And so in having some of these discussions, it's pretty amazing. And I think that there are going to be people who read my book and go, oh my God, I can't believe this is my job, or this is what my company is now espousing, and what do I do? Because the reality is this has become business social credit. It's corporate fascism in a way, and the very big players, including the BlackRocks of the world, want to push an agenda down, and they have the capital to really bully companies into compliance. And as we're recording this, a video has been making the rounds of Larry Fink talking about how you really need to force people to do what you want them to do. And this is very much one way that he has done that. The scary part is he's doing it with other people's money, retirement funds, our investment funds, that he is going and taking and using it to basically hold these executives hostage, and to say, you need to be on board with thinking the right way, or we're going to direct capital away from you. And as a C-level executive, that's a very scary proposition.
And you go over some examples maybe in your book about how ESG has had terrible real-world effects already in places like Sri Lanka, right?
Yeah, I mean, Sri Lanka is sort of the most interesting case study, because it really was held up as this ESG model country. And what's fascinating when you go through the book, and when I did my research, is that the same names pop up over and over again. The World Economic Forum, the UN, BlackRock, these names keep popping up, and they play a role in Sri Lanka's story. And when the same names pop up a few times together, you might think it's a coincidence. But when it happens like over and over and over again, it's pretty hard to think that it's a coincidence. So, several years back, Sri Lanka was held out by BlackRock as an interesting investment thesis. At the same time, you have these PMs in the country who are talking about how they're going to make the country rich, and they're going to do it by embracing these ESG ideals. And they're very much, all entrenched with the same people. And what happened, as I think most people know the story, is that one of the campaign promises that the not current president, but previous president had campaigned on was that, we are going to transform our farming, which is a huge industry in Sri Lanka. And so, they tried to take over some of what the farmers were doing. The farmers pushed back, and the compromise position was, okay, well, we'll just ban chemical fertilizer and you just can't use it in the country anymore. And that happened, to a horrible effect at the same time that other things happened. COVID obviously brought in less tourists, and they had a lot of debt that was denominated in dollars. So not to downplay that those played a role, but this was a huge, massive issue for them. And it ended up transforming the country from this one that was on the rise and getting lots of investment capital and having a strong and thriving middle class and shopping centers to a country with a food crisis, something that they hadn't had in modern history. And obviously, they had, a whole kind of social unrest. They ousted the president. Funny enough, the PM who then became the president was actually one of the people who was also behind this ESG nonsense. So it is somewhat surprising that they still were like, okay, we'll go with this guy despite his role. But it really, you can see the way that unfolded, just completely devastated the country. But, they had a great environmental index score. And, that's just the laughable part about the whole thing. I mean, there are countries in Africa as well, where they actually had massive power outages. And they had great environmental score, which is, I guess, if you don't use any electricity, it's great for the environment. It's not so great to live in, but, you get a really good score. And that's, kind of the underpinning of a lot of this, is that these concepts, which sound really great, aren't really great for human flourishing, as my friend Alex Epstein likes to say. And, I think that foundationally, it is something people are really going to have to get their heads wrapped around. And I think is very much tied into the concept of, you will own nothing and controlling the population. And the concepts of messing with things like food supply, if you control the food, you certainly control the people, are just very much sister concepts.
What do you think is really going on in these problems they're having in the Netherlands with killing off the cattle and seizing farms? What is going on there?
Well, I'm going to ask you, Tom, after listening to this, I told you that the Prime Minister of the Netherlands was part of an organization that like to reinvent and reshape and reimagine things. What organization might you think that he might be tied in with?
Either the UN or WEF.
Yes, frankly, both of them. Okay. But he's definitely very tied in with the WEF. And they are part together of something called the Food Action Alliance, which again, stated purpose is to reimagine and rethink and reshape the global food supply. And, you just have to look at these people and say, everything, like things were going pretty well with the food supply until you guys got involved. You're the ones who are creating the issues here. Don't think we want you to be the ones to now solve this problem that you've created. So Mark Rutte is the prime minister's name there, and he is very much entrenched in the WEF and all of these kind of alphabet soup concepts that are going on there. And obviously in the Netherlands, the farmers are also pushing back, while the politicos in the country are trying to say, no, we must do this for the good of the world. And again, we're talking about another place that is a major agricultural hub, particularly for Europe. And that would have serious implications, not just for the country, but for many other countries as well. And so again, this is like very nefarious stuff. This isn't like, oh, well, we have sort of a disagreement on the way they're going about this. We're talking about messing with the food supply and food security and things that, really are foundationally in the right direction in a modern world, and trying to move us back to the dark ages. And, it's all being done, in my opinion, in the name of trying to control and, institute the ideas of a handful of people. And, who says these people should get to make the decisions on behalf of everybody? Nobody elected them. They have no particular expertise in doing so. So why do these people get to make the decisions for the world. And it's a frightening scenario.
Do you think there is just a handful of people at the WEF that have enormous power whose names we might know? Is it Schwab? Is it a tiny core, or is it a whole thousands of people, or what?
So I haven't tried to quantify all of the people. And I think, again, part of the issue is that people, because, human nature is to act in self-interest, tend to do the things that work for whatever it is they're trying to accomplish and sort of ignore the rest. So I don't think it's as much a 10 people sitting around a table going, okay, here is our master plan. But it is people who have these God complexes and think that they're really smart, or just trying to grab more power or more resources, or some of all of the above, and finding these alliances to be able to do it. Certainly Schwab is very much, again, in my opinion, at the center of this. He's been trying to put out this concept of stakeholder capitalism since 1971, and has repackaged it and changed the names and changed the tenor. And I'll give him credit. I mean, he is a persistent MFer. So he has found a way to just stick with it. And then through his own connections, kind of created himself in the middle of all these other connected people. And we've heard him say things, and you can go, again, this is not conspiratorial. You can go find the tape of him speaking at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and saying things about penetrating the cabinets, and how so many of the people who were part of the World Economic Forum, Young Global Leader program are now in these places, and particularly in Canada. That's, one that he calls out, but certainly, previously with Angela Merkel in Germany and other places. And so it's clear that, there is an intention there of trying to get these connected people to carry these ideas into places. So certainly there's some core group of people who are intentionally doing this, but I think there's just a lot of profiteers, as I call them in the book, people who are finding a way to enhance their money and power by, sort of aligning with some of these ideas that may not really care about the fundamental reshaping, but are finding a personal benefit to it. And having a lot of those is as devastating as having a handful of people who are, kind of crafting these ideas.
So in this anti-farm movement in the Netherlands, how big of a factor do you think this climate crisis scam is, that these people really think we have to kill off the cows because their farts are causing bad weather? Do they really believe that themselves?
Well, so this is the way I view the world, is I don't listen to what people say, I watch what they do. And when you have people who are flying around on private jets and building mansions at the waterfront, and enabling all kinds of behaviors that doesn't look like there's an emergency, then it says to me there is no emergency. Like, if there was an emergency, if my house was on fire or was at risk of being on fire, there are some pretty concrete things that I would do. So there are actions you take in an emergency. None of them have taken any actions and try to explain away why, oh no, it's important because I'm an important person and I'm trying to solve this. So it's okay if I do it. But really everybody else needs to act this way. So I don't believe that there is any emergency. Again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be good stewards of the planet. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thoughtful about great new technologies and things that we think that are going to be better for not just the planet, but for humans' way of lives. I mean, that's, what we've done for a really long time, and it's worked very well. But there certainly is no emergency, but they use that as a way, it's the symbiosis. And I talk about this model in the book. Peter Thiel talked about it in a talk, and then I sort of changed it into sort of my own language. But, you get these ideas that come from a good place, kind of a thoughtful, hey, we want to save the climate. Hey, we want to have more diversity. Things that people generally agree with, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then they get this profiteer class that makes all this money from living and dying by it. And then they get the useful idiots who are the ones that get the social credit and the benefits and can wear the emojis or put the emojis on their profile and wear the t-shirts and the hats. And they get to be part of the cool, right group and get the, oh, you're a good person, pat on the head. And it's a very symbiotic thing. But at the end, do I think there's good intentions? I'll share another anecdote from the book. I talk about one of the best vintage Twilight Zone episodes. You may know where I'm going with this, but there is, and there's many to choose from, but one that I particularly like that I talk about is this one where aliens come down from another planet and the people of Earth going, why are there aliens here? What do they want? And the aliens basically communicate, hey, we see you have famines, we see you have war. We have technology. We've eliminated all of that. And we just want to share our technology and help you out. And, as they should be, the people of Earth are a bit skeptical. I'm not really sure that's what they're here to do. So they give them a lie detector test. They pass the lie detector. And while they're, basically passing the lie detector, you've got a group that's kind of like a CIA type of group that's decoding the name of a book that they accidentally left behind. And they get the name of the book and they find that it's To Serve Man. They go, well, that's exactly what they just told us. They said they're here to serve man. It's a very noble intention. Pass the lie detector, that they must just really want to help us, right? Why would people be doing things for the good of other people? Well, they're just helpful people, Tom. Well, so the people of Earth, they decide to go up in the spaceships and start visiting the aliens' country. And just as a member of the CIA group that was trying to crack this code is boarding the spaceship, one of his colleagues runs behind and goes, To Serve Man is a cookbook. And that's really my takeaway from all of this is that I love, obviously it's trademark infringement, so I'm not going to do it, but To Serve Man is a cookbook, should be the mantra of all. It's like people are self-interested. They're not doing this for the good of humanity. To serve man is a cookbook. And I feel like that's just the underlying takeaway here.
Very good.
Have you seen that episode, by the way?
I have not. On a different podcast, I heard about it there.
Okay.
I love that story. Yeah, that's a great one. What is China's role in this? Do you think they are actively pushing DEI and ESG in the West here or not? Or they just want to build solar panels and make money off the green scam that way?
I think that China is reveling in having these people that they don't even have to do anything with that are going and basically manipulating the world to their advantage. I think Russia is also in that same scenario. And I feel like it's emboldened them to do some of the actions that we've seen them undertake of late. But China loves this because they know that not only are they one of the major polluters of the world, and nobody seems to care. They seem to think the globe is like a smoking section. Like, oh, well, if you don't smoke over here, or even if they smoke over there, this section doesn't get any smoke. It's the same thing, right, with this whole global warming. Well, we don't do this, but, who cares that they're polluting over on the other side of the globe? It makes no sense. And, China is set to benefit, obviously, from all of the green pushes because they are a major provider of a lot of the rare earth minerals and a lot of the other components that go into many of the quote unquote green products that obviously aren't so green when you sort of get down to it. It's just a different kind of pollution and set of issues that, of course, nobody can have a rational conversation about because we're just not living in the time of having rational conversations, I guess. So I think that they really love it. What they are doing is creating models of really bad practices that we're starting to see here. Things like they're not doing the DEI, they're not doing the ESG, but they are doing the SDS, which is the social credit system. And they actually have, probably the most advanced social credit system in the world. It's not as advanced as some of the internet conspiracies put out there, but it is pretty well advanced. And it's really a regional system. So depending on what jurisdiction you're in, you might get a letter grade, you might get a number grade. It's not consistent through all of China. And it really depends on what the priorities of that particular jurisdiction are. And they award points to you if you do good things. And obviously good things are subjective, and they take points away from you if you do bad things, which again are subjective. And depending on the area, good things could be donating blood or going to see your parents or saying nice things about the government on social media, not frightening at all. And bad things are things like, obviously not paying your debts, but things like cheating at video games and taking up too much room on an airplane and jaywalking and not saying nice things about the government on social media. And some of the punishments are actually very Orwellian. There are a lot of people on the blacklist there who cannot travel. They can't get on, trains and airplanes and whatnot. NPR ran a story about a gentleman named Lao Juan, who was basically an intermediary in the coal industry. And when the Chinese government changed its policy on coal, it completely destroyed his business. And so all the money that he had taken out in terms of a loan, he couldn't pay back, but he couldn't pay it back because the government all of a sudden decided to change their policy one day and didn't do anything to help him out. And so he went into town and found his picture up on an electronic billboard where it said, "This is an untrustworthy person," and had his sort of name and his ID number. And what he communicated to NPR was that he saw other people who were his colleagues in the coal industry that had befallen the same issue, this government shift that changed their fortunes for the worse, that then put them on the blacklist, that were up on this very Orwellian billboard. And so, we may go, oh, well, that's China. That would never happen here in the US. But we have seen that. We lived through COVID and the insane policies that came out of COVID. And there already was a bunch of social credit. We saw people, whether or not you took the vaccine, gave you a special card. And yes, it was analog, but that's just the first form factor, right? Like not necessarily the last form factor. And you could maybe go to a restaurant, or maybe you couldn't, or you could have a job, or maybe you couldn't, or they shut down your business. All of those kinds of things. We also saw in recent times from the Twitter files, the fact that people were being censored from social media for some of their views. Our neighbors to the north, Freedom Convoy, saw their bank accounts frozen. So this idea that, it's just these communists in China that are doing this, it really is starting to seep in to what's happening here in North America and in the United States, which is, just mind-blowing, but really ties into this thesis around you will own nothing. Because if you think about what social credit is, even in the form of cancel culture or light social credit that's not, completely formalized at the state level, it comes after your social standing, which is your opportunities for work. It comes after your job, which is the way that you earn a living and get that money to invest and buy things. And in the case of COVID, for many businesses, particularly small businesses, it actually came after your business, the things that you actually own. So having lived through that, you can see why that piece is really an important part of this thesis. Some of the you will own nothing is that buy-in, I'm just going to give up my rights, but some of it may be forced down your throat.
And this whole climate crisis scam, as I see it, is it's a way for the central planners to have complete control of our lives. I think you mentioned elsewhere, they keep track. They could shut off your credit card if you bought too many hamburgers or too many flights. They can control everything and say it's because of climate.
I think that, you talk about the credit cards, one of the things that China's also a bit ahead on that is, coming to bear here is something called a central bank digital currency, or a CBDC. And again, it sounds innocuous because, people like cryptocurrency. Oh, isn't a digital currency the same thing? Well, absolutely not. The whole concept, the reason that cryptocurrency came to be is because people were worried about the fiat money that we have and basically the destructive policy of the Fed and the government, the destruction of our purchasing power and ultimately our wealth. And so they wanted something decentralized that you wouldn't have these government and government adjacent entities manipulating for their own benefit. And so they came up with things like Bitcoin, which is entirely decentralized as a countermeasure. A central bank digital currency, on the other hand, is the opposite. It is completely centralized and it's controlled by the Fed and the government, to their whim, if they want to have that level of control, because it's built in there. It would be the equivalent of having a microchip in every dollar that you have, or having a credit card with the Fed or the government that they can kind of go on a transaction by transaction basis and intervene. And so they're going to try to sell this to the people who don't understand, either as a government-friendly and protected way of doing cryptocurrency to trade off of that confusion. Or perhaps they promise UBI if you sign up. Perhaps they offer to trade 4 of your dollars for 1 digital dollar. Isn't that a great deal? And most people, the same people who screamed for stimulus during COVID, not understanding the inflation implications they were going to have to deal with on the other side, would go, wow, that's great. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be a millionaire. And, I think that they could also say it's a way for them to control inflation. Hey, we can control inflation. You won't ever have to have that again. Yeah, because if they want to shut down spending, they'll literally shut off your spending in order to change the price of things. So I think there are a lot of scary ways that can be enabled. It does need to be authorized by Congress. So that's something that we should really keep an eye out for. We've seen some sneaky attempts for them to try to work in language around that, and that is, continuing to be ongoing. Even some of the anti-CBDC bills have been criticized as perhaps creating loopholes that would actually end up enabling it to come to bear in a different form. So that's just one thing people need to really keep an eye on, and then also plan for, Tom. I mean, really, if we get to a point where there is something like a CBDC and the government and the Fed have complete control and they want to affect climate change and policies and say, well, you've had too many burgers this month, so we're going to shut you down. What are you going to use? Like, how, what kind of alternate economy can you move around in? You do have other things that you can use as a medium of exchange and to barter with. And I don't think people have wanted to go there yet. There's some people who have, but it's a pretty small percentage of the population. And I think we need more people to be at least planning for that plan B, because that is a potential emergency. And when there is a potential emergency, you act like there is a potential emergency and you do those kinds of things, and you don't fly around on a private jet.
So Florida and Arizona, or in some local places, there is some state government pushback against ESG and maybe against CBDC as well. Are you optimistic about that pushback?
So I'm optimistic that there are entities that are pushing back. I think a lot of these concepts are kind of like whack-a-mole, that once you think you've got it, something else pops up somewhere else, and you just kind of have to keep hitting it. ESG will likely end up taking on a new name. We've already seen, sustainable investing, sustainable principles, other names that are starting to pop up, because as more people are getting clued into what ESG is, and as we're having pushback at some of the state levels, that may just be a catalyst for them to just try and shift the name. But we really have to kill it at the source and create a structure where that kind of stuff isn't allowed to invade our system. And that means rolling back the Department of Labor rules under the Biden administration and some of the other dreck that is out there. But, it is encouraging to see some of that pushback. As I said with the CBDC, it's a little concerning because some of the pushback isn't being done well. And so it may end up accidentally, no good deed goes unpunished. It may accidentally end up letting that into the system. So I think we need to get much smarter people around the people who are proposing this, unless they're intentionally trying to create a backdoor, which some may and some may not. I'm not going to, weigh in on that, but we need to button that down for me to feel good about that.
What do you think is the best way for us to push back? Like, read your book, right? Spread the word, talk to people. And I don't know if you talk to people in your normal life that have no idea any of this stuff is going on.
Every day, every single day. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I think it's really important, is a lot of these concepts sound really conspiratorial. And frankly, a lot of the people who started the discussion around them are nuts. Let's just be honest. Like, they might be right about this, but they're nutty about a lot of things and don't have a lot of credibility. So what I try to do in the book is let the information speak for itself and let the sources tell you the story. I let Joe Biden tell you in his own words that there's going to be a new financial world order. I quote Larry Fink and the BlackRock letters to shareholders and letters to CEOs from 2020. So he can tell you how he is trying to use ESG to reshape things, and that if you're not aligned with them, you're not getting the capital. I go to the 10Ks and the annual reports of companies like Tricon Residential and other home companies, Invitation Homes, that are competing with you to buy homes, competing with the average homeowner. So you can see how they're laying out, your misfortune, your inability to create wealth as a huge financial opportunity for them. So these are all really well-sourced examples. And it's real hard to say it's a conspiracy theory when the president's saying it, or when it's in their published SEC documents, right? Like that's not my opinion. That's literally what they're saying. So it makes it much easier to tell the story. So I do that and connect the dots. I've done all the research for everybody, but I think it is really important because there are so many forces coming at us at the same time that any one of them would be very overwhelming. But you also requires a different response, right? The way that you're going to respond to what's happening with CBDC is going to be different than you're responding to what's happening with big tech, which is going to be different than what's going on with social credit. And so you really need to understand the information before you kind of figure out what that plan is. And then you can get people to sort of join you in the appropriate fights. And, we're not going to be able to fight every one of these fights perhaps on our own, but if we get enough people to read them, we could go, okay, I can address this, and you can address this, and you and your people can address this, because this is one of those like individuals standing together types of situations. We need a lot of people who are willing to push back on it, and it's for their own benefits.
Do you think that there is a new world order coming regardless? Like, it was the Dutch, then it was the British, then the Americans. So it's just a question of what that's going to look like, though. It's coming one way or another. Is that right?
It's a question, in my opinion, and many other people's opinions, of duration and structure. There's no doubt that there's no point in history where somebody's been able to be the center of the fiscal universe or otherwise for all of time. Sometimes, obviously with Rome, they implode by themselves, which I think is sort of analogous to the United States, is that, that call is coming from inside the house. And that I think we have an opportunity to delay it. But at some point in time, and it could be, a year, but it could be 50 years or 100 years, that is going to happen. The scary part for me is that there's no sort of great option that's waiting in the wings, right? When you had the Dutch kind of waning, it was between the British and the French. You can make some arguments there, but whatever. When the British were waning, we were waiting in the wings. The people who are waiting in the wings now are not these bastions of great ideas, freedom, individual rights, capitalism. These are bastions of tyranny and dictatorial rule. So if we are no longer the center and the leader of the global financial universe, it's not because there's a better option coming down the line. And I think that's the really frightening part. Now, the reality could be, and this is whether it's a transitional phase or a longer term phase, is that it could be that there is no leader. There's just kind of chaos in these little blocks for some period of time. And I think that's a likely scenario where the US's stock kind of drops, but doesn't go away entirely, but there are these other big alliances. But that can only survive for so much time. And then some power wants to take over and to have that leadership position. So that's a little frightening. And the other thing that I've noted, at least in modern times, is that not every war has brought about a new financial world order, but all of the new financial world orders that we've seen have been brought about by war. So, that's also not a thing that gives folks a lot of comfort. But again, if you kind of internalize this as a risk and can evaluate it and try to mitigate it as such, that's really the intention here. And the intention is not to scare people. This is actually meant to be a book of optimism and to give you a plan to fight back, because I do think we can make a difference in our lifetimes, but it's going to be hard. And so, we need to be thinking about where these risks are coming from and address them appropriately.
You talk about World War F, as in Frank. What is that?
So, this entire thing really is wrapped up in what I call World War F, which is a global financial war where you are effed. So that seemed to be, between the financial and the fact that you're effed, that F seemed to be the right thing about it. The crazy thing as we talk about war is that, war is usually a quest to dominate other people and their resources, right? If you think about those expansionist wars and these dominating empires, and they go out and they conquer people and they get their resources. In many ways, what's going on now is our own government that is trying to dominate our resources. And so it's very much an internally focused scenario. And I think that people need to be aware of that distinction, because obviously it's much less palatable today, in today's world, for the US to go, hey, we're running out of money, so we're just going to go conquer some countries and loot all their money to pay for our stuff. Like, that doesn't fly. But they can really easily do it and say, oh, we're doing this, for your benefit and to expand the government. They can legally plunder the citizens of the United States, and everyone just kind of goes, okay, yeah, that's great. So I think that's an important distinction, and just kind of understanding the financial situation of the government and what's ahead is really important. But given the fact that we are in World War F, and there are all these other folks who are kind of on the sidelines, it does not preclude that there may be other geopolitical and big global wars that could kind of facilitate what's happening as well.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your previous book behind you there, The War on Small Business? Is it about the whole idea of central planning and that these small businesses are harder to control, so let's get rid of them?
Yeah, it really was. I had the distinct honor, but also really stupid of me to agree with, because it was really difficult to do, although I guess now I'm glad I did it. But the honor to be approached very early in COVID based on some of the writings that I had done, and going, this is going to go the wrong way. Don't do this. This is going the wrong way. To basically catalog what happened during one of the most historic economic events in history. This was the most historic transfer of wealth, and it went from Main Street to Wall Street. And so I was entrusted to basically follow along with what happened and watch the decisions that were made that did the direct transfer of dollars through shutting down mostly small businesses, not based on data and science, but based on political clout and connections. And then sort of the quieter transfer with all of the Fed intervention, including going back to the zero interest rates and then taking their balance sheet up to nearly $9 trillion. And, that's a piece I don't think people really understood. But, at its core, as you said, it really was a book about central planning and this kind of struggle between decentralization and centralization. And, as we're talking about with You Will Own Nothing and sort of this elite group of central planners, whether or not they're connected, decentralization works against them. It's CBDC versus crypto, small businesses versus big businesses. Right now in the US, there are more than 32 million small businesses. They're very independent. They're very hard to control. They're across demographics, geography, industry, whatnot. There's like 20 some odd thousand big businesses, and they have money to give to campaigns and lobbyists and whatnot. So if you're like going on the path of least resistance, what route are you going? Are you going to go with the people who have the money, who are easier to control and where you can go, oh, we'll scratch each other's back? Or are you going to try to deal with, all these people who are just trying to live their lives and saying, we're going to mind our own business? I mean, it's just a non-starter from a centralization of power standpoint. And we're just in the phase of the story of the cycle, as we talked about, where that's just become much easier for them to do. And, staggeringly, I think potentially the biggest surprise is how many people went along with it. And that doesn't bode well for them thinking, hey, maybe we shouldn't try something like this again.
I'm hoping they won't go along with it the next time. It seems like people have learned something. They have, haven't they? Please tell me they have.
So you seem very much more optimistic than I do. I don't think there are people who have. There are more people today who are less tolerant of it than they were, perhaps a year and a half ago. There are still plenty of people who think everything was the right thing to do. They do it again, and they're going to be the first person to turn on you when you don't follow along with the narrative. And that's just the reality.
That is sad. One other unrelated quote from you I liked is you called Harvard a hedge fund with a university attached to it. You want to talk about that a bit? Yeah.
So I'm known for coining this phrase. A few people co-opted this, but I many years ago, probably 10 plus years ago on TV, I came up with this. And Harvard's endowment has gotten so large and so out of control in the kinds of things that they're investing in that basically they've become a hedge fund. And I kind of feel like the whole university thing is sort of secondary to that. And they actually play a role in You Will Own Nothing as well, as we talk about not only the wealth transfer that's happening from young people to colleges and universities, but also the grab for land and water rights. And one of the sort of hedge fund-esque things that Harvard did is they went into California under an LLC with a different name, Brodeia, which is the name of a flower. And they started buying up vineyards at what people were saying locally were like, seemed like pretty high prices. And they're like, this couldn't be, who is this entity? Because I wouldn't pay this if I wanted to just have a vineyard. And it turned out that it was Harvard that was buying up these vineyards for the water rights that were underneath them. And so this kind of cycles back to our discussion about controlling the food and controlling the land and the farming. And you have, not just wealthy individuals that are out there, but now you've got Harvard via its endowment that went through, and at one point in time, they had valued this at like $300 million worth of water rights just in California in terms of these vineyards. Now, the status of that is opaque. They did have some sort of a transaction. Everybody is unclear on whether it was that they exited that fully or they just did some sort of entity type of transfer, but the entity that Brodeia still exists today. I checked with the the registrar in California, and they were still active. So there's something still going on there, but it kind of just brings up whether it's Harvard or some of these other connected entities. They are going after things like land and water. They're looking to financialize water, and they're trying to move it to quote unquote its highest use, which doesn't necessarily mean you getting fed. it means, making a quick buck off of it. And all of this, again, is tied into this massive fight that we're fighting in terms of ownership. And if you look at the cover of my book, of all the things you may not own, the last one that's crossed out is your life. And, there's sort of a freedom aspect to that, but there's a real aspect to that as well in terms of protecting, the food and the water supply.
Do you have anybody else's work that you'd like to recommend, their Twitter feeds or their books, anything like that is related to your work?
So, gosh, I mean, I quoted and sourced like 600 plus different entities. And I tend to do a lot from kind of mainstream media that somebody who might disagree with me would go, oh, well, it came from the New York Times or it came from the Washington Post. So I'm going to trust that more than, this entity that I don't like. But there are so many tremendous people who are thinking and working around these issues. I hate to name one for the 10 people that I'm going to forget, but I do try to call them out in my Twitter feed, and certainly have some great interviews in the book. I can tell you that Jim Rickards, who you may know, who's just fantastic, is in there. He talk about like deep knowledge. He's one of the people who let me know that Harry Dexter White, who was the person who was negotiating, was the Treasury Secretary that was negotiating on behalf of the U.S. during Bretton Woods, that he was actually a Stalinist agent. And, then of course I did the research to prove that. So basically the Soviets helped set up the US financial system for the sole purpose of crushing Great Britain, which is kind of interesting. And again, something to keep an eye on. But, his insights in there are fantastic. But I talked to Tiffany Justice of Moms for Liberty about issues around children. I talked to Ron Coleman, who is a lawyer, focuses on a lot of First Amendment cases and things like that, about things that we can do in terms of structurally pushing back. Larry Salzman from Pacific Legal, which is another group that takes on lawsuits to fight the government. Things like, when they try to come and take your house away because you haven't paid your property taxes, and they want to not just get the fine back, but they want to get everything else, those kinds of things. So I tried to include, a number of voices like that within the book who hopefully add a little flavor to the discussion. But most of the stuff is coming directly from the horse's mouth. And not me as a horse.
Excellent. Okay. Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap up here?
No, I mean, thank you for having me on this discussion. I hope people will take the time to read the book and to pass it along, because I think this is going to be critically important in terms of empowering yourself about all of these things that are ahead, but also giving you that plan to fight back. We didn't really get into that piece of it. But, whether it's behavioral or financial changes, there are things that you can do on the individual level and also the community level that, again, may not be able to stop all of the forces going on in the world, but at least, doing the kinds of things that the elite are doing to put themselves, in a position to come out on top. You want to make sure that you're emulating that and not just listening to what it is that they say. So appreciate the support of the work, and I promise that people will get a ton of value from it.
Okay. Thanks for taking the time. I really respect the work you're doing. Fabulous work. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Talk to you later. Carol Roth.